The big question on everyone's mind, are we headed for a recession, and if so, when?
Well, we think that there is a very high risk of recession, likely in the first half of 2024. That means consumer spending will be slower, businesses won't be investing, and the government won't be as supportive. But we do think that we'll get out of it in the second half of next year.
And so what kind of impact are we going to see in terms of the job market? What should people expect in terms of their job security?
Well, the interesting thing is that there's still a lot of labor shortages, and for that reason, many companies are actually not letting people go. They're holding on to their best workers, and they're paying them a little bit more. And you also have some companies that are still hiring, especially those in healthcare, government, and also leisure and hospitality. So we think that's still going to continue.
So you think people should be, if they are in a situation where they're concerned about their job security, looking into those industries and perhaps trying to figure out what skills they have, if it's in a different industry, would fit into those types of industries. Is that helpful?
Yes, exactly. And still people are quitting and they're joining those jobs that have seen bigger wage gains. But certainly if you're in finance or tech or even retail or transportation, you might be a little bit worried about your jobs. But certainly you can go into many of those other types of jobs like utilities or even other parts of retail and even construction away from housing where they're still hiring and still looking to hold on to their best workers.
So even if your wages are fairly secure, you think going into 2024, people are still feeling like personally they're in a recession. Inflation, higher prices on everything from food to housing to right now people looking at their health care for open enrollment. They're just concerned about how they're going to be able to afford things with such high prices. When do you think inflation and will start to ease a bit and prices will start to come down?
Well, you're absolutely right. Everything just about is very expensive, but we're thinking that inflation is going to trend back to the Fed's 2% target next year. By the end of next year, we should see much lower inflation, and consumers should see a break in terms of their real incomes. That means incomes after inflation. And so with that, we expect that the consumer will be back at spending probably at pretty decent pace next year, certainly after we get through this soft patch.
We've definitely seen consumer spending holding up pretty well during this time, but we have seen consumer confidence fall a bit for the third straight month, in fact, in October. How much of that is due to inflation, persistent higher prices, and how much is it due to geopolitical concerns that are really weighing on folks' confidence right now?
Well, we do ask consumers what they're thinking. Number one, they're still concerned about inflation, in particular food and energy. They're saying those things are just too expensive. They're also saying that interest rates are very high, especially if you're looking to buy a home where mortgage rates are roughly above 8%. And even if you're looking to buy that car to replace the car you've had for 11 years, it's much more expensive. Thereafter, we do have more consumers saying they're concerned about geopolitics, but for the most part, it's inflation, higher interest rates, and concerns about their incomes and finances going forward.
A lot of folks are very concerned about the housing market. You mentioned that. It's basically frozen right now with such high mortgage rates. What needs to happen for it to gain strength, and what should buyers or sellers potentially be thinking right now?
Sure. Well, there's a reason why the housing market is frozen. It's part of the Fed's plan to cool off the economy. When you raise interest rates, it makes it more expensive to buy a house, and that actually helps cool inflation. In fact, when we look at inflation, most of it is in the housing components. Once the Fed starts cutting interest rates, probably towards the middle of next year, we should start seeing more easing in terms of mortgage rates. Right now, mortgage rates are very high, but as the Fed starts to signal cuts, that I think mortgage rates will come off and more people will re-enter the market.
So what kind of action should a potential buyer be taking right now?
You should still save up for that down payment because you're going to need it. Home prices in terms of levels are higher than they were back in 2019, even though they're not rising as quickly. So it's really great to have that down payment and also to have some money on the side to furnish the home and potentially put in a new car.
And if people are thinking about downsizing and maybe selling their home, is the time to do it right now, before the end of the year, or at the beginning, early next year? What's the timetable?
Well, the challenge is if you own a home, you probably have a very low mortgage rate. I know my mortgage rate's around 3.5%, but if you sold your home, you'd be looking at a mortgage rate that's above 8%. And so that's preventing a lot of people who own homes from selling and downsizing and going someplace else. And so it's probably best to wait.
Understood, understood. You know, when you talk about consumer debt, many people have run out of savings. They're turning to credit cards to cover basic household items. We've seen actually a recent spike in delinquencies on nearly everything from credit cards to auto loans to personal loans. What impact could that have on your money for the next year?
Well, indeed, consumer credit is really high. Credit cards are more than $1 trillion in aggregate. And the Fed just released data that show, well, the New York Fed just released data that show that, yes, delinquencies are up for credit cards, homes, loans, and they're actually slightly higher than we were back in 2019. And so I think what consumers need to think about is maybe pulling back on some of the spending and looking at maybe paring down some of that debt, certainly as the cost of carrying that debt has risen with interest rates.
You know, it's difficult. Some people may say if I have to use my credit cards to actually bridge that gap between what I can afford for basic things and what I have available right now. How should they be looking at managing the debt that just seems to continue to grow?
That's a tough question. In fact, why do people even have debt? Not because they want to, but oftentimes because they have to. And so it's really going to be about economizing, finding ways that you can downsize what you're buying. So instead of buying luxury brands, you might buy store brands, or even cutting the plug, cutting the cord, and shifting to other types of entertainment. Instead of going to the movies, maybe you stream at home, or maybe you do things that are less expensive. So it's really going to be about making sure that you can meet those basic needs and not so much the wants.
The thing that people want to understand as well, particularly millennials who have really seen a spike in delinquencies, is how am I going to be able to afford all that I have, and also now for some pay back student loan debt? How is that impacting overall debt levels and delinquencies?
Student loan debts absolutely are going to weigh on consumption because now you don't have the excess income to put towards it. So we definitely think that consumers' spending is going to decelerate, certainly into that recession that we talked about, owing to student loans. Indeed, 43 million people in the U.S. have some type of student loan, and most of the people who have them are between 35 and 50. Those are peak spending years, so it's happening at a really dangerous time for a lot of those millennials.
So for those who can't make the payments right now, the good news for them, at least in terms of their credit reports and their credit scores, it's not necessarily going to impact that right away. They get a reprieve for a few months. But credit reporting agencies have made some changes, and they're looking at different things in trying to figure out how credit worthy you are. One of the biggest drivers of debt for many people is medical debt. That's no longer in credit scores. I'm wondering if that's going to skew the picture at all about how well consumers are really holding up.
Well, I think that's certainly useful, especially for older Americans who are more likely to have medical debt. But the key thing is just looking at how credit rating agencies look at debt and also look at credit worthiness. So, for example, if someone is paying their rent as well as their student loan, then that's good news that they are still a credit worthy person. So I think it's really about redefining how credit is used as well as how it's rated.
You were talking about older Americans and what they need to be focused on. A lot of them are focused on their savings and making sure they have enough to last their lifetime. What impact do you see from changes in retirement plans under Secure 2.0? Is it enough to boost the savings rate for younger Americans to make sure that they have enough money to continue to be financially secure? Or are most Americans living paycheck to paycheck and not being able to save?
Well, for a lot of baby boomers, older generations, they retired early. Certainly many of them retired during the pandemic because their financial assets and also their housing assets appreciated. So they should be okay. But certainly any legislation or rules that encourage younger people to save is a good thing. It may not solve all the problems, but it's certainly a great start. You know, Gen X, Y, and Z need to think about retirement. Anything that they can do now to help save is going to be important for later.
If you had a 3-point action plan for folks, Dana, going into 2024, we're here in the fourth quarter. People are trying to figure out what's happening with this economy. What action should I be taking with my money? A lot of folks taking notes right now, participating in our chat here about what they want to do and what they think they should do for 2024. What's your advice to them?
Sure. Well, some of the things I already mentioned, like looking at your budget for the week and when you go grocery shopping, do you need the name brand or can you go with the store brand? Do you need name brand clothing? Can you go with, going to a thrift shop or even going to one of the cheaper brands? Think about ways that you can economize. Also, wherever you have a few extra dollars, put it towards your debt, making sure that at least you pay the minimum payment so that you don't incur the higher interest rates that we're seeing, certainly as the Fed has raised interest rates. And then certainly save if you can. Every dollar counts. And certainly you may not be able to save a lot, but a little bit can add up, especially if you're gaining a decent amount of interest. So those are the things that I would recommend for Americans.